Look at it, a barn animal in a ball gown. You can dress it up, but it still stinks of the mud it came from." The words weren't spoken. They were spat. A venomous shard of glass that ripped through the velvet tapestry of the starlight soiree. 1,000 champagne flutes paused mid-air. 200 heads, heavy with diamonds and dynastic pride, swiveled with a single, synchronized crack of bone. Their practiced, philanthropic smiles dissolved into identical masks of exquisite, ravenous shock. The air in the Celestial Tower's grand ballroom, just a moment before humming with the golden, honeyed glow of a dozen colossal chandeliers, suddenly turned thin and sharp, smelling of ozone before a lightning strike. The string quintet, deep in a soaring piece by Mozart, sawed their bows across their instruments, creating a sound like a dying scream before falling into a deafening, absolute silence. Every eye, from the new money tech titans to the old money aristocrats, was now locked on a single brutal tableau. At the very center of this sudden vortex stood Isabella Sterling, the evening's hostess and the city's reigning queen. She was a creature forged from moonlight and malice, a living sculpture whose family name was carved into the granite foundations of the museums, opera houses, and libraries that formed the city's cultural spine. Her skin was so pale it seemed to drink the light, her lips a slash of blood red, her hair a waterfall of platinum blonde cascading over shoulders, left bare by a gown of molten gold that seemed to taunt the very stars outside the panoramic windows. The entire glittering night was a jewel in her perfectly manicured hand, and now she held its undivided, merciless attention. In her other hand, she held a delicate porcelain plate. On it sat a pristine slice of Black Forest gâteau, its dark chocolate sponge and whipped cream peaks crowned with a glistening blood-red cherry. A smile so drenched in smug superiority it was toxic twisted her perfect mouth. Then, with a flick of her wrist as casual and dismissive as shooing away an insect, she sent it flying. The impact wasn't loud, but it was wet and obscene. The cake didn't just hit Dr. Anya Sharma, it detonated against her. A thick, violent smear of chocolate, cream, and cherry liqueur exploded across the side of her face, dripping from the sharp line of her jaw onto the immaculate sapphire blue velvet of her gown. For a single suspended beat, a moment frozen in the amber of pure disbelief, the entire ballroom held its breath. And then the laughter began. It started as a nervous, hesitant titter from someone in the back, a single pop of sound releasing the unbearable tension, the sound of gratitude that they were not the one in the crosshairs. Then it swelled, blooming like a toxic fungus, growing into a harsh, braying chorus of derision. Phones like a swarm of metallic locusts rose into the air, their lenses hungry, their red recording lights blinking like malevolent eyes. A portly man in a tuxedo, a shipping magnate whose name was on one of the university's libraries, coughed into his fist before surrendering to a wheezing, teary-eyed chuckle. Isabella Sterling bathed in the sound. The molten gold of her dress shimmered as she tilted her head back, a triumphant peal of laughter spilling from her throat like acid rain. "It seems a doctorate still can't buy you a pedigree, can it?" she declared, her voice a silver scalpel slicing through the cacophony she had so gleefully orchestrated. Her entourage, a trio of surgically perfected socialites, shrieked with sycophantic delight. But Dr. Anya Sharma did not break. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She didn't even tremble. She stood perfectly still, her spine a column of unbendable steel beneath the defiled velvet. Her sapphire gown, an elegant, floor-length sheath, hugged a form that radiated a power no amount of cake could diminish. Her hair, A cascade of dark, intricate braids swept into a regal updo revealed the stark, serene lines of her expression. And that expression was one of terrifying, absolute calm. Slowly, with the deliberate, sacred grace of a queen performing a coronation rite, she lifted her hand. 2 fingers, elegant and steady, scraped the thick concoction of cream and chocolate from her cheek. She examined it for a long moment, a completely unreadable emotion flickering in the depths of her dark eyes, and then she let the glob fall to the polished marble floor. Splat. The sound was minuscule, barely a whisper in the cavernous, vaulted hall. Yet it carried with the finality of a judge's gavel. The laughter faltered. The wave of mockery hesitated, its cresting power suddenly broken. A subtle, uneasy shift rippled through the room. Guests exchanged nervous, questioning glances. In the back, a voice laced with a dawning, sickening horror whispered, "Wait a minute, is that... Do you know who that is?" Isabella, emboldened by what she perceived as her absolute victory, swirled the champagne in her flute. The gold fabric of her dress hissed as she leaned in closer to Anya, her smile sharpening into a stiletto. Her words were a venomous whisper, yet perfectly pitched for every billionaire, politician, and blue-blooded heir to hear. Some worlds, darling, have walls for a reason. Some people are meant to stay on the outside, with their faces pressed against the glass. A few chuckles answered her, but they were weaker this time, thin and laced with a new, creeping uncertainty. Some laughed because they felt they had to, their fortunes and social standing irrevocably tethered to the sterling name. Others just looked away, a sudden hot shame prickling their skin. But every single eye kept returning to the woman at the center of the storm, the one covered in cake, who was radiating something far heavier and more dangerous than humiliation. Before we watch the fallout of this public execution, take a second and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of silent power reaches. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. And if you believe that dignity is the only armor that can never be pierced, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. Stories like this one don't just happen, they are the earthquakes that signal a shift in the entire landscape. Your support helps us measure the tremors. We're so glad you're here. Now, back to the silent woman in the sapphire dress. Anya Sharma's silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't surrender. It was weight, a gravitational force that seemed to press down on the imported Italian marble, to suck the oxygen out of the gilded air, and to smother the last dying embers of their cruel laughter. The night had been meticulously engineered to humiliate her, to put her in her place, to remind a woman of color that no amount of personal success, no degree, no fortune could ever buy her entry into their sacred, inherited world. Instead, they had given her their undivided attention. They had handed her the stage. And though not a single soul in that room knew it yet, the hurricane had already made landfall. This soirée had been splashed across the glossy pages of high society magazines and lifestyle blogs for 6 months, billed as the philanthropic event of the decade. It was a night for 8-figure donations and multi-billion-dollar deals whispered over flutes of vintage Dom Perignon. The Celestial Towers ballroom was a cathedral built to the god of money. Frescoes of mythological figures cavorted on the vaulted ceilings, their painted eyes gazing down on the mortals below. The floors were polished to a dark, perfect mirror, and the 3 colossal chandeliers dripped diamonds of light onto the chosen few. This was not a party. It was a performance of power, a public rehearsal of the unspoken hierarchy that ruled their universe. Isabella Sterling was the undisputed star of that performance. She had moved through the room like a golden phantom, her heels clicking a sharp, authoritative rhythm against the marble. Guests orbited her, drawn by the irresistible gravity of her family's name. There were banking heirs whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower, tech founders in their 20s who measured their worth in commas, and dowagers draped in jewels that could fund a small war. To them, Isabella was not just a hostess. She was a gatekeeper. Her family's name was chiseled into the stone facades of half the cultural institutions in the state. This gala was her coronation, and tonight she had just exercised her divine right to decide who belonged. And at the center of her kingdom, Dr. Anya Sharma stood, marked by chocolate, her sapphire velvet dress ruined. Around her, conversation tried to reboot, stuttering back to life in fragmented whispers and awkward, strained laughter. People were talking to fill the terrifying void her silence had created. No one moved to help her. Not a single person offered a napkin, a kind word, a gesture of solidarity. Such was the chilling power of the hostess. Her contempt was a virus, instantly contagious. To stand with the victim was to volunteer for social exile. Utterly classless, muttered a man in a perfectly tailored Brioni tuxedo, shaking his head but pointedly refusing to meet her eyes. She must have provoked her. She must have done something, whispered a woman dripping in emeralds, her voice a low, vicious hiss, as if the victim herself were to blame for the assault. Above them all, Isabella laughed again, a sound that echoed through the enormous hall, a conductor's baton, setting the cruel rhythm of the night. The catering staff, their faces impassive masks of professional neutrality, continued to circulate with champagne and hors d'oeuvres as if nothing had happened. The string quintet, after a sharp nod from the conductor, hesitantly picked up their bows again, but the music sounded thin, fragile, desecrated. The atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. It was thick now, charged with a strange, dangerous electricity. Every glance that darted toward Anya was a toxic cocktail of morbid curiosity, primal fear, and a dark, reptilian hunger for more drama. She didn't move. Not yet. Isabella raised her glass in a mocking toast, her smile dripping with the nectar of her triumph. "To those of us who understand our place," she announced, her voice ringing with a chilling finality. A ripple of forced, hollow chuckles answered her. Guests lifted their glasses, their eyes darting nervously, desperate to align themselves with her power without completely drowning in her cruelty. What none of them saw, what their privilege blinded them to, was the stillness of the woman they were mocking. For in that stillness was a gravity of its own, heavier than the chandeliers, denser than the marble, a silence that pulled every eye, every thought back to her again and again. The ballroom belonged to Isabella Sterling, or so it seemed. But a tsunami does not announce itself with a trumpet. It gathers its power in the deep, silent places, building a terrible momentum until the weight of the water becomes impossible to ignore. And tonight, the tsunami was standing quietly in a sapphire dress, watching, waiting, and calculating. The laughter didn't fade. It mutated. Emboldened by its own cruel momentum, it crashed louder, feeding on the silence of its target. The ballroom, moments before a picture of dignified opulence, now resembled a Roman Colosseum, where social assassination was the evening's entertainment. The glow of smartphone screens formed a constellation of voyeurism. Red recording dots blinked like malevolent eyes from a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, capturing Anya's humiliation from 100 different angles. A man with a neatly trimmed beard, a venture capitalist known for his ruthless takeovers, zoomed his phone's camera in on the slow, dark drip of frosting falling from Anya's jaw. A young influencer, barely 20 with millions of followers, turned her phone to her own face, whispering into the microphone. OMG, you guys, you are not going to believe what is happening at the Sterling Gala. Total meltdown. Epic fail. Wait till you see this. Drama. She giggled, flipped the lens back toward Isabella, and raised her glass in a silent cheer. Isabella was drinking it in, a narcissist at a feast. She strutted to the edge of the low dais, the molten gold of her gown molding to her body, her smile wide enough to be a wound. She gestured with her flute toward Anya. "You see," she crowed, her voice a clarion call of contempt that silenced the murmurs. "Proof that money can get you a ticket to the party." She paused for effect, letting the cruelty hang in the air. But it can never, ever buy you belonging. The crowd roared. Some clapped enthusiastically, others merely smirked, their amusement a shield for their cowardice. Not a single soul interfered. It was the first and most sacred law of the elite. It is always safer to laugh with the predator than to stand with the prey. Allegiance to the gatekeeper, absolute silence for the victim. A waiter, his face pale and his hands trembling, stumbled past with a silver tray of handcrafted miniature eclairs. Isabella, without looking, plucked one from the tray. She examined it for a second, then with a theatrical underhand toss, hurled it at Anya's feet. The pastry exploded into a shower of cream and crumbs across the sapphire velvet. "Oopsie," Isabella cooed, her face a mask of faux innocence as her friends howled like hyenas. Anya Sharma remained a statue of serene stillness. The chocolate on her face was like tribal war paint, her dress a testament to their barbarism, her dignity seemingly flayed from her bone by bone. Yet her posture was unbroken. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders were squared, her eyes were unwavering, taking in everything. The cruelty, however, had a fever now. It had to keep climbing. A man in a deep navy tuxedo leaned toward his date, his voice a stage whisper sharp enough to be overheard by a dozen people. "Can you imagine thinking she could just waltz in here and blend in? It's honestly laughable." His date, a woman with lips plumped into a permanent pout, giggled nervously, covering her mouth with her hand, though her eyes flickered with something that might have been pity, or perhaps just fear. Another guest, a grand dame of the city's art scene, muttered to her companion, "She ought to be grateful she was even invited. Some people simply refuse to understand the hierarchy." Isabella drank their words like fine wine, each comment intoxicating her further. She held her glass aloft once more. "Let this evening be a lesson for everyone," she declared, her voice filled with messianic fervor. "Lineage, heritage, true elegance, these are not things you can imitate. They are things you are born with. They cannot be bought." The pronouncement hung in the air like a poisonous perfume, sweet and reassuring to those desperate to believe they belonged, suffocating to anyone who dared to challenge the premise. The cameras kept rolling. The laughter pressed in harder. The humiliation was no longer just a personal attack. It was becoming a viral spectacle, a piece of digital history. The image of the chocolate and the sapphire velvet, of arrogant power and silent dignity, was already being captured, copied, and shared across 1,000 different feeds. And still Dr. Anya Sharma did not move. She simply took a breath, slow and deliberate. Her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room. She was not seeing them with fear or shame. She was seeing them with the cold, patient clarity of a strategist, watching her opponents move all their pieces into a perfectly designed trap. The ballroom believed it was witnessing the spectacular fall of a social climbing pretender. What they were actually watching was the deep, terrifying silence just before the lightning strikes. The chocolate frosting had begun to dry on her cheek, the sugar turning tacky and tight under the relentless heat of the chandeliers. The sapphire fabric of her gown, once a flawless sweep of color, was now a battlefield map of smears and stains. To everyone in the room, she was a symbol of epic social failure. But inside her own mind, she was something else entirely. There was no chaos within her. There was only a chilling, diamond-hard clarity. She could hear the voice of her grandmother, speaking to her from a memory 25 years old, in a small kitchen that smelled of cardamom and rain-soaked earth. The world will not test you with fire, my little lioness. It will test you with ice. They will try to freeze you out, to make you feel like a ghost in their house, to shame you in the middle of their great halls. Remember this. Dignity is not a sound you make. It is the silence you command. The waves of laughter rippled again, sharp and cutting as shards of broken glass. Phones hovered like vultures, documenting her stillness. Isabella, her golden dress a weaponized glimmer, lifted her glass for another toast, another barb, another dose of venom. The entire ballroom danced to the rhythm of her cruelty like marionettes on invisible strings. But Dr. Sharma didn't truly hear it. She was listening to the steady, metronomic beat of her own heart. Thump, 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 thump. Each inhale was a reminder. She had fought and won wars in boardrooms far more brutal than this gilded cage. Each exhale was a release. She had survived rooms colder, crowds crueler, and humiliations far deeper than this. Her silence was not an act of surrender. It was an act of calculation. The frosting on her skin had become a mask, but not of shame, of patience. Every smear of chocolate, every crumb of pastry clinging to her sapphire dress was a mark in a ledger, an itemized list of an arrogance for which an invoice would soon be delivered. She could feel the psychic weight of the room trying to crush her, to force her spine to bend, her shoulders to slump, her eyes to fall. Yet she stood, resolute. Her gaze drifted briefly, clinically, toward Isabella. The hostess's laughter was a wide, gaping thing, all teeth and gums, her eyes gleaming with the ecstatic superiority of a bully who has found the perfect victim. Around her, the guests drank and clapped and mocked, their complicity sealing the moment. The power dynamic of the night seemed absolute, unshakable. But in that brief glance, Dr. Sharma saw what no one else did. A flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor in the flawless performance. Cruelty is the last refuge of the insecure, her grandmother had told her, and arrogance is the brittle armor of the afraid. Her eyes continued their sweep of the crowd. Men in bespoke tuxedos, women dripping with generational diamonds, influencers whose only asset was their fleeting relevance, every one of them complicit, every one of them blissfully certain of their safety within the herd. She wasn't memorizing their faces with rage. She was cataloging them with the dispassionate precision of an auditor. Then, slowly, she drew another long, deep breath. Her silence deepened, expanded, until it became a physical presence in the room. A hurricane does not shout its name. It gathers its power in the distant, quiet ocean, unseen and unheard, until the very pressure of the air changes and becomes too heavy to breathe. That was what she felt in her chest now, the gathering, the inexorable swell. They thought they had broken her. They thought chocolate and laughter had succeeded in reducing her to a pathetic object, a mere prop in their grand theater of superiority. But they hadn't broken her. They had given her a gift, a stage, a microphone more powerful than any in the building, and an audience that was watching with rapt attention, believing they were witnessing a downfall. They were profoundly, catastrophically wrong. Because this humiliation was not her epilogue, it was her overture. The air in the ballroom had now curdled. What had begun as a singular act of spite had metastasized into a full-blown public spectacle. Isabella Sterling, her golden dress blazing like a supernova under the crystal lights, knew her audience well and played to them with the practiced cruelty of a seasoned performer. She stepped closer to Anya, her gold heels striking the marble with sharp, punctuating clicks. A fresh plate of multicolored macarons was whisked from a passing waiter's tray. She plucked a lurid pink one from the pyramid, rolling it between her thumb and forefinger like a bullet. Then, with a casual flick, she sent it flying into Anya's lap. The crowd roared. Another one followed, a sickly green one, landing near her feet and shattering into a cloud of almond dust. "Oh, darling," Isabella purred, her voice dripping with condescending pity, loud enough to be captured by every phone. "That sapphire is such a delicate color. What a shame it stained so easily." The laughter came faster now, sharper, more feral. The phones rose even higher. A young socialite whose grandfather had built his fortune on predatory lending whispered to her companion, "This is absolutely savage. I love it." Her own camera was shaking slightly as she struggled to keep it steady. An older matriarch, a string of perfect pearls glistening at her throat, chuckled into her glass of Chardonnay, having long ago made the choice to find amusement in the suffering of others rather than question her own conscience. Isabella began to circle Anya, a golden shark circling her prey. "You see, ladies and gentlemen," she announced, raising her champagne flute as if delivering a lecture. "Our guest tonight thought a fat bank account could buy her a crown, but crowns are not for sale." She leaned in conspiratorially. "Crowns are inherited, crowns are born." The words struck like polished stones. A few gasps of feigned shock mingled with the sounds of genuine, cruel delight. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were participating, feeding on the spectacle like piranhas. Every sneer, every smirk, every clinking glass was another nail in the coffin of decency. Anya remained utterly still. Her sapphire dress, now a disaster of chocolate, cream, and macaron dust, clung to her like a banner of quiet endurance. Her face was a mask of unnerving calm, but her refusal to collapse seemed only to infuriate the room further. Isabella noticed. The triumph in her smile flickered, replaced by a flash of annoyance, and then it sharpened into pure venom. She leaned in so close their faces were almost touching, whispering for the benefit of the nearby microphones and cameras. "You should be grateful, you know. I've given you more attention tonight than you will ever deserve in your entire life." The blatant cruelty drew a fresh round of applause. Someone started clapping slowly, mockingly. From the back, a man's voice, thick with liquor and entitlement, shouted, "Show her the door!" And with that single cry, a chant began. Quietly at first, then gaining volume. "Out! Out! Out!" Isabella Sterling spread her arms wide, a malevolent conductor basking in her orchestra of contempt. Her golden dress shimmered, her grin widened, and she made a grand theatrical gesture toward the ballroom's massive gilded doors. The chant rose to a roar, the phones filmed with fervor. The humiliation reached its terrible peak. But amidst the jeers, the insults, and the deafening chaos, Dr. Anya Sharma's silence remained a fortress, untouched and unbreached. She stood in the very eye of the hurricane, a column of stone in a raging sea, absorbing every insult, every laugh, every syllable of the chant. And in her stillness, something unspoken, something powerful, began to shift the very foundations of the room. The mob believed they were casting her out. They had no idea they were simply setting her stage. The cruelty had finally reached its crescendo. What was about to happen next would silence every last one of them. The chant was a physical force, echoing off the marble walls and crystal chandeliers. Out, out, out! It thundered with the righteousness of a verdict delivered, swelling with each repetition until the very air seemed to vibrate with the sheer power of their collective scorn. The faces in the crowd gleamed with a feverish mixture of sweat and malice, their phones held high, red recording lights blinking like a horde of watchful, unforgiving eyes. Isabella was ecstatic. She raised her arms higher, a malevolent priestess conducting the ritual sacrifice. Her golden gown blazed as she spun in a slow, triumphant circle, displaying the crowd's unwavering allegiance, as if their derisive laughter were diamonds woven into her dress. "You see!" she screamed over the deafening noise. "This is what happens when pretenders try to wear crowns they haven't earned!" And still, she stood. Dr. Anya Sharma did not move. The chant was a tidal wave crashing against a granite cliff. It was loud, relentless, and utterly powerless to move her. The chocolate was a hard shell on her cheek. The crumbs and stains were a modern art masterpiece of cruelty on the sapphire velvet of her dress. But her spine remained straight as a spear. Her chin remained lifted. And then it happened. She raised her hand. Not quickly, not in a desperate plea for mercy, but with the calm, measured deliberation of a monarch calling for silence in her court. Her fingers straightened, her palm held steady. A simple gesture, so stark and so unexpected that it sliced through the roar of the chant like a surgeon's scalpel. A ripple of silence spread out from her in concentric circles. Voices faltered mid-word. Phones zoomed in closer, trying to comprehend the shift. Isabella blinked, her triumphant grin twitching at the corners, the first sign of a crack in her perfect facade. "Oh," she sneered, taking a half-step closer. "Has the little mouse finally found her squeak?" But Anya didn't speak. Not yet. She simply reached up and wiped another streak of frosting from her collarbone. She held the dark smear up between her thumb and forefinger, examined it, and let it drop. The sound of the chocolate splattering on the marble floor was almost inaudible, but it cracked through the room with the force of a gunshot. The room froze. For the first time all night, it wasn't the hostess, but her target who commanded the silence. Eyes shifted nervously. Guests glanced at one another, a current of uncertainty arcing between them. The script of the evening's performance had just been violently rewritten. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, resonant, and carried through the cavernous hall without any need for a microphone. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do?" The question wasn't loud, but it struck the room like a bolt of lightning. It held no anger. It contained no plea. It was a warning, delivered with the chilling finality of a verdict. Isabella laughed, a nervous, brittle sound that she tried to mask with bravado, tossing her hair back over her shoulder. "Do what? Remind an imposter that she doesn't belong?" Dr. Sharma's gaze cut through her, steady and unblinking. Her silence stretched again, heavier this time, a palpable force that seemed to suck the very sound from the air until even the violinists in the corner seemed to shrink behind their instruments. The crowd began to stir uncomfortably. A man in the front row slowly lowered his phone. A woman pressed her lips into a thin, tight line, the smirk she'd been wearing all evening suddenly looking foolish and ugly. The absolute certainty that had fueled the lynch mob's chant now wavered, cracked by the weight of a calm they could not possibly comprehend. Isabella forced another laugh, louder this time, sharper, a desperate attempt to regain control. But within that laugh, there was a fragile, high-pitched note of panic, something the entire room was just beginning to hear. Because for the first time all night, it became terrifyingly clear to everyone that Dr. Anya Sharma was not the victim they thought she was. She was the storm they had mistaken for silence. The silence she now commanded was thick, heavy, almost unbearable. 200 pairs of eyes stared at her, the dried chocolate on her cheek like a strange foreign medal. Her sapphire dress was a ruin, but her presence was utterly untouchable. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, static, and every second stretched into an uncomfortably long eternity. Then the whispers started. "Who is she?" a young man muttered, lowering his phone and turning to his friend. "Seriously, I know I've seen her face before. Wasn't she on the cover of Fortune or something?" Another guest whispered to her husband, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she shook her head. "No, it couldn't be. If she were that woman, she wouldn't just be standing there taking this." But the seeds of uncertainty had been planted, and they were spreading like cracks across a frozen lake. The unified chant had died. The confident laughter had evaporated. In its place, a nervous murmur multiplied, 100 different questions crawling through the opulent ballroom. Isabella made a desperate attempt to seize the narrative back. She lifted her champagne glass again, forcing her lips into a wide, brittle smile. "Don't be fooled by a power suit," she sneered, her voice shrill. "A fancy magazine cover doesn't make you royalty. This is my house, my city, my world. She's just another wannabe outsider trying to force her way through the door." But her voice no longer held its whip-crack authority. It wavered ever so slightly, trying to rise above the growing tide of recognition. Guests were remembering news articles, television interviews, photos from global economic forums. They had seen this woman's face before, not smeared with dessert, but framed by headlines that spoke of global logistics, technological innovation, and fortunes measured not in millions, but in billions. Dr. Sharma stood unmoving, letting her silence speak more articulately than Isabella's frantic words. Her eyes scanned the crowd, resting for a brief, powerful moment on those who whispered, just long enough to make them drop their gaze in a flush of shame. Then she spoke again, her voice still quiet, still steady, each word a perfectly chosen weapon. "You believe I am here tonight because I needed your invitation." Gasps rippled through the hall. The sheer audacity of her tone struck harder than any insult. It was not the sound of defiance, it was the sound of absolute certainty. A man near the front shifted uneasily, tugging at the collar of his tuxedo. "Wait," he whispered urgently to his wife. "Isn't she the one who bought out Consolidated Air Freight?" His voice trailed off, but the question hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. Phones were no longer recording, they were now weapons of research. Guests scrolled with a feverish intensity, their fingers tapping, screens glowing in the dim golden light. And there it was, her face, unsmeared. Her name, Anya Sharma, founder and CEO of a global tech and logistics empire. And next to her name were numbers. Numbers that made the collected wealth of everyone in that room feel like pocket change. A woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Another guest whispered, a choked sound of horror, "Oh my God." Isabella saw it. Panic flashed across her face like heat lightning before she smothered it with another paper-thin laugh. "Don't let her fool you," she shouted, her voice verging on a screech. "She's a nobody, a nothing." But even as the words left her mouth, her eyes were darting desperately toward the crowd, reading their horrified expressions, feeling the catastrophic fracture of her control. Dr. Anya Sharma didn't need to shout. She let the murmurs do the work for her. She let the devastating truth bloom like wildfire in dry grass. She had always understood a fundamental principle of power that no one in this room ever had. It doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from making others lower theirs. The tide was not just turning. It had become a tsunami. Isabella Sterling could feel the marble floor slipping out from under her golden heels. The humiliation had been her weapon to wield, but now the revelation was no longer under her control, and the storm, silent for so long, was finally terrifyingly about to break. The ballroom was buzzing now, a frantic hive of nervous electric whispers. Smartphone screens glowed, faces illuminated in the stark white light, growing paler as the brutal truth cut through generations of insulated rumor. They had come here tonight expecting cheap theater, some juicy gossip, a safe, socially sanctioned spectacle of public shaming. Instead, they found themselves staring at a woman whose corporate empire was woven into the very fabric of their lives, into the industries they depended upon, into the stocks that padded their portfolios. Dr. Sharma let them whisper. She stood firm in her ruined sapphire dress, the chocolate on her cheek now a badge of honor, her silence more potent than 1,000 speeches. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low but crystalline, slicing through the nervous din like a diamond cutting through glass. "Some of you in this room," she said, her eyes sweeping over them with cold, dispassionate assessment, "sign contracts with my subsidiaries without ever bothering to read the name on the letterhead." A sharp, collective intake of breath. Someone's phone slipped from their nerveless fingers and shattered against the marble floor. A man in the second row, the venture capitalist who had zoomed in on her humiliation, went rigid, his face draining of all color. He recognized her name now because it was the signature on the quarterly 9-figure funding checks his firm received. Isabella's laugh was brittle now, sharp as splintering glass. "She's bluffing. This is just a performance. Don't listen to a word she says." She tried to raise her champagne flute in a defiant gesture, but her hand was shaking so badly that golden drops spilled over the side, tracing a path down her wrist. Dr. Sharma slowly turned her gaze back to her, calm and utterly unflinching. "You call this your house, your city, your world." She paused, letting her voice gain weight with every syllable. "But please, Isabella, tell us all, what happens when the lines of credit that finance your father's art galleries, your mother's boutiques, and your family's real estate holdings simply vanish? By sunrise?" The words fell like granite stones into a silent pond. The last of the laughter was swallowed by a vacuum of pure dread. Guests shifted on their feet, glancing at one another. Some of them already knew. The others were realizing for the first time that their comfort, their wealth, their very social positions were all threads in a vast, intricate tapestry that she, Dr. Anya Sharma, held the power to unravel with a single command. "Enough!" Isabella snapped, her voice cracking against the high, vaulted ceiling. "You don't scare anyone here." But her own friends were looking profoundly uneasy now. Their smiles had frozen into brittle masks. Their laughter was a strangled memory. One man muttered under his breath, "She controls the Meridian Tech Fund, doesn't she?" Another whispered back, "And the shares in Global Pacific Airways. My God, she's that woman." Anya took another slow, deliberate breath, as if she possessed all the time in the world. She raised her hand again, palm outward, not to command silence this time, but as if to steady the violently shifting room. The ballroom leaned in, a collection of captive souls listening in spite of themselves. "Are you certain?" she repeated softly, the words an echo of her earlier chilling warning. "That this is the stage you want to stand on with me?" The question didn't just fill the room, it remade it. Power itself tilted on its axis, a subtle but undeniable tectonic shift, the first deep tremor before a cataclysmic earthquake. Isabella tried to laugh again, louder, more hysterically this time, but it was hollow, reedy, the sound of utter desperation. Her golden dress still sparkled under the lights, but it no longer blazed with authority. It looked like tinsel. The crowd wasn't even looking at her anymore. Their gaze was fixed with a mixture of terror and awe on the woman she had tried to destroy. The woman standing calmly in a ruined gown of sapphire and chocolate, radiating a storm from which no one could escape. And for the very first time all night, raw animal fear flickered not in the victim's eyes, but in the hostess's. Isabella Sterling's smile had now cracked beyond any hope of repair. Her crimson lips were stretched into a terrifying rictus, trembling at the corners. The laugh she tried to summon again died in her throat, choked off by the wall of silence pressing in from all sides. Her golden dress still blazed under the crystal chandeliers, but it no longer radiated power. It clung to her frame, a shroud of desperation. Dr. Anya Sharma took another deliberate step forward. The marble floor gleamed beneath her heels. The chocolate had dried into dark scars across her sapphire gown, but with every passing second, she seemed to stand taller, her presence filling the vast ballroom more completely than the chandeliers or the music ever could. Her voice was steady, each word a perfectly calibrated instrument of destruction, every syllable carrying the crushing weight of inevitability. This foundation you celebrate tonight, this Sterling Heritage Foundation you are all here to toast. She paused, her eyes locking with Isabella's. Show of force. Runs almost exclusively on my capital. A gasp tore through the crowd like a physical shockwave. 200 heads turned as one toward Isabella, whose face had blanched to the color of ash, as if the words themselves had struck her. I have personally invested $12.5 billion into the very structure you so proudly claim as your family's empire, Dr. Sharma continued. Her tone was not boastful. It was factual, clinical, surgical. And tonight, in front of all your allies, your patrons, and your cameras, I am formally withdrawing it all. First there was silence, then absolute panic. Guests gasped. Phones which had been put away were whipped out again. Conversations exploded in frantic, terrified whispers. A man clutched his chest, muttering to his wife, "That's the entire lifeline of the foundation. It's everything." Another man hissed to his companion, "Without her, they're not just broke. They're liquidated. They collapse." Isabella staggered back a step, the champagne flute finally slipping from her nerveless grasp. It shattered on the marble, a small explosion of crystal and sound. Champagne bled across the floor like liquid gold, pooling at the heels of her golden shoes. You can't," she stammered, her voice suddenly tiny, stripped of all its former bravado. "This is my family's—" "It was," Dr. Sharma cut in, her voice calm, her words final. "But now, it ends." The weight of those 4 words crushed the air from the ballroom. The guests who had howled with laughter at a woman smeared with frosting now stood pale and silent, their own comfortable futures unraveling in the space of a single sentence. The glamour of the gala disintegrated, replaced by a cold, metallic dread. The whispers were no longer about gossip. They were about survival. She just pulled nearly $13 billion. The gala, the foundation, it's over. They'll lose everything. The houses, the collections, everything. For the first time, every single eye in the room completely abandoned Isabella. They turned fully and completely toward Dr. Anya Sharma. They were not looking at an object of ridicule, nor were they looking at a victim of their cruelty. They were looking at the sole, absolute power in the room. Isabella tried to speak again, but her voice broke into a pathetic, whispered sob, drowned out by the storm she herself had summoned. Her invisible crown, the unspoken authority she had wielded so brutally all night, had shattered, and everyone in the room saw the glittering fragments of it lying at her feet. Dr. Sharma raised her chin, steady, unbroken, and let the silence hang for 10 long seconds, sealing the truth in amber. The humiliation had not just flipped. It had become an annihilation. The gala no longer belonged to its hostess. It belonged to the woman she had tried to destroy. And the empire that had spent a century mocking the outside world was crumbling to dust before their very eyes. The ballroom imploded into chaos. What had been a shrine to refined privilege moments earlier now devolved into a scene of raw panic. Phones buzzed with frantic calls and messages. Diamond-studded patrons, their faces pale, clutched their devices as if that $12.5 billion had been vacuumed directly from their own accounts. "Get finance on the phone now!" one man hissed to his assistant, his voice tight with dread. "They'll announce this to the markets by morning. We have to sell off," another guest muttered, his eyes darting toward the exit as if sheer distance could shield him from the radioactive fallout. Isabella Sterling stood frozen, a tragic figure in a golden dress, champagne pooling around the shards of her shattered life. The dress no longer shimmered. It looked gaudy, vulgar against the sheer magnitude of what she had lost. The so-called friends, allies, and donors who had orbited her all evening backed away one by one. No one reached for her hand. No one offered a comforting whisper. They turned their backs, suddenly desperate to disassociate themselves from the cataclysmic collapse happening in real time. A young socialite pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders, muttering, "She's finished. Utterly finished." A woman who just an hour ago was seated at Isabella's right hand leaned into her husband's ear. "We should leave now, before we're photographed anywhere near her." It was too late. Photographers from the city's major news outlets had already arrived, drawn like sharks to the scent of blood in the water. Cameras flashed, their bright, merciless light capturing Isabella in her moment of utter ruin, her arrogant crown fallen, her inherited power stripped bare. And in every single photograph, framed just behind her, stood Dr. Anya Sharma, calm, composed, the chocolate still clinging to her sapphire dress like a testament to her survival. News alerts began to ping on phones all across the hall, a digital chorus of doom. Breaking: Dr. Anya Sharma withdraws $12.5 from Sterling Heritage Foundation. Shock at Starlight. Soiree: hostess publicly humiliated as empire collapses. Power shift: tech mogul dismantles century-old dynasty overnight. "This is my family's legacy," Isabella cried, her voice breaking as she looked desperately at the indifferent crowd. No one listened. Her words dissolved into the growing murmur of reporters, the clicking heels of guests arranging for their cars, the hushed whispers of lawyers already calculating their billable hours. Dr. Sharma hadn't moved. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke with more authority than the rising panic. Her stillness was a center of gravity, drawing every eye, every headline, every last shred of allegiance toward her. Above the grand fireplace, a massive oil-painted portrait of Isabella's great-grandfather loomed, a stern symbol of dynastic power. Tonight, its gaze seemed almost to mock his descendant. Beneath it, his entire legacy crumbled, abandoned by the very people who had cheered her on just an hour before. The chant of "out, out, out" that had once targeted Anya now seemed to hang in the air over Isabella herself. Not spoken aloud, but written in every averted gaze, every hurried step toward the gilded doors. Her kingdom had fallen, and at its very center, as calm as she had been at the beginning, stood the woman she had tried and failed to humiliate. She was no longer the target. She was the architect. The ballroom was no longer a place of glamour. It was a tomb, a ruin of trembling gold silk, of champagne staining marble like a memory, of whispers that cut sharper than the Mozart quintet ever could. Isabella stood abandoned, her empire a pile of smoking rubble glowing in the light of smartphones and news cameras. But at the epicenter of it all, Calm, unbowed, stood Dr. Anya Sharma. She did not rush her exit. She did not gloat. She simply adjusted the shoulder of the sapphire dress that clung to her form. The chocolate frosting had hardened on its fabric like battle scars. Her hand brushed a final streak from her cheek, not to hide the evidence of the assault, but to reveal the unwavering steadiness of her gaze beneath it. Reporters surged forward, their questions sharp and hungry. "Dr. Sharma, is it true you've pulled the entire endowment?" "Will the sterling found